Hi, I am Mladen Čičić from GIPSA Lab, and I'll talk about the work that we've done with the University of Seville on coupling the electromobility with the power grid in order to reduce the curtailment of renewable energy sources. In recent years, we've seen a steady increase of the portion of the renewable energy sources in the power mix, and this trend is only likely going to continue into the future. While these energy sources are both sustainable and cheap in general, they do pose a bit of a problem for the power grid. For one, their generation tends to be distributed over a large geographic area, and more importantly, they do tend to be intermittent, which means that we cannot really control how much power they're generating at any given time. In fact, often the only way we can control them is to shut them down, which is known as curtailment. Unfortunately, we do indeed need to do this sometimes due to the limitations of the power grid. This is of course a waste, and we can partially deal with this by introducing additional flexibility and in particular energy storage into the grid. There is hope that as electric vehicles become more and more prevalent, we might be able to use their batteries for this purpose if we are able to control their charging appropriately. Therefore, the question that we're asking in this talk is how can we use the electric vehicles to reduce the renewable energy sources curtailment and help the overall power system? The situation that we're looking at in particular looks something like this. We're considering people commuting between home and work using electric vehicles and maybe stopping along the way at a public charging station. We assume that there is RES generation at each of these aggregated ports, as well as some loads at home and work, and finally EV charging working as a form of a power storage at each of these ports. The electromobility layer describes how EVs move and how their state of charge evolves both while they're on the road and while they're at the charging station. The power grid layer connects these ports and imposes constraints which might lead to RES curtailment. Our goal is to minimize this while also keeping the state of charge at an acceptable level. In order to do this, we consider the dynamics and constraints of all of the components of the system and control the rate at which the EVs at each of these charging stations are charging or discharging in case we have vehicle-to-grid power flows. I'll quickly go through all of these components. First, we have the electromobility model, for which we use an extended and simplified version of our coupled traffic energy and charging model, or CTEC, and here I'll only give a very brief overview. The dynamics of the traffic are described by the well-known cell transmission model, which is a conservation law where we essentially split the road into cells and then track how the traffic density in each of these cells evolves over time. Then we describe the energy dynamics by looking at the evolution of the energy density, which is given as traffic density times the average state of charge in each of these cells. As the EVs move along the road, they will be carrying this energy with them, as well as discharging some of them, and both of these depend on the speed of the traffic. The model is completed by the charging station model, and this model is also a conservation law, but whereas the CTM was looking at how the traffic density was evolving in space and time, we're instead interested in how the concentration of EVs, according to their state of charge, evolves in time at a single charging station. The charging station dynamics are then connected to the dynamics of the road through appropriately defining all of the ramp flows so that the EVs that leave the road via some off-ramps enter the charging station that are connected to it and vice versa. The extension that we've made in this work is in considering multiple classes of vehicles that can share the road and have some different characteristics. For example, this could be fuel vehicles and electric vehicles, but in this case we're assuming that all of the vehicles are electric. Instead, what we choose to do is to differentiate between the vehicles that are traveling along the mainstream and those that are entering the road from the public charging station. This is because the state of charge of the ones that are entering from this charging station is likely to be significantly higher than that of the ones that are on the mainstream, and we'd like to avoid these states of charge being simply averaged. Charging stations are particularly important because they serve as the only interface between the electromobility and the power system. In general, there are three things we might be able to control. First, we have the charging rate of EVs that are present, and this could be different for EVs with different state of charge. Next, we have how many vehicles that are entering the charging station and how many of them leave. In the end, the power of the charging station is given by summing up the charging rates of all of the EVs. And note that this power can also be negative if we're doing vehicle to grid and have negative charging rates. These three theoretically give us a lot of control over the dynamics of the charging stations, but from the perspective of the power grid, the only thing that we care about is what its power is. Therefore, we will use this power as a high-level control input and then make sure that the charging stations follow this reference by using some low-level charging rate heuristics. Further, we assume that the portion of EVs that enters the public charging stations depends on their state of charge, according to the function that you see on the right. Essentially, the lower their state of charge is, the more of them will enter. When the EVs reach the end of their trip, they enter the home or work charging station, depending on which leg they were on. Finally, we schedule the flows of EVs that are exiting the charging stations with the departures from home and work following some predefined commuter time profiles, and so that the EVs that are leaving the public charging station do so after some predefined dwell time. Next, we have the model of the power grid. We define the bus power injections at home, at the public charging station, and at workport as the sum of their respective loads, charging power, and renewables generation. We then systematically pose the grid equations using a pi scheme for each of the power lines, and finally get the equilibrium bus voltage and the line powers. These are particularly interesting to us because the grid constraints are formulated through them. Finally, we're able to combine the electromobility model with the power grid model. The electromobility part is dynamic, with the full electromobility state evolving over time, given charging station powers, and the power grid part is static, consisting of algebraic equations. From the power grid side, we also get how much curtailment is necessary, and from the electromobility side, what the range of power that each of the charging stations can achieve, and what its energy reserves are. Essentially, if it was represented as a battery, what would its capacity and state of charge be? With all this done, we are now able to formulate the control. Our control objective can be represented by this cost function, with the first summoned corresponding to minimizing the RES curtailment, and the second one to keeping the overall state of charge within some satisfactory levels. We do receding horizon control, where the constraints are given by the combined model dynamics and the grid operational constraints. And as I mentioned before, the two most interesting ones are the constraints on line powers and node voltages. We end up with a closed loop system with multiple time scales, with the power grid dynamics happening essentially instantly due to them being described by algebraic equations. Then we have the electromobility dynamics, which are on the level of minutes due to numerical constraints. And finally, we have the control, which happens with a 1 hour time step. Finally, I can show you some simulation results. We compared the controlled case with the uncontrolled case, where all of the charging stations are providing a constant portion of their maximum power. You can see the commuter demand profiles. In blue, we have departures from home. In red, we have departures from work. And you can see that there will be two peaks, one in the morning, one in the afternoon, as expected. The state of the electromobility model is shown here. And in these plots, we have either space, in case of the road state, or state of charge, in case of the charging station state, that are shown on x-axis. And on y-axis, we always have the time. The states are shown color-coded, with warmer colors representing a higher value. And going from left to right, we first have the state of the home charging station, then the traffic density from home to work on the road, then the state of the public charging station, then the road from work to home, and then finally the work charging station. You can see that all vehicles start at home, then they travel to work, then they spend some time there, and then finally return home, and some of them do stop at the public charging station. The full electromobility state of the road consists of two classes, and you can see here the traffic density and the state of charge on the bottom of the first class and of the second class, which corresponds to the EVs that are entering the road from the public charging station. And as you can see, the state of charge of these vehicles is significantly higher. Here are the power profiles of the three ports in the uncontrolled case. The thick red line indicates when the power line was overloaded, which caused the RES curtailment. And you can see that happens at home and it happens at the public charging station. Instead, in the controlled case, we're able to absorb much more RES generation at the public charging station, though we cannot do much about the renewables at home because there are very few EVs present when the peak happens. At that time, most of them are actually at work. And comparing the curtailment cuts, you can see that our control does indeed achieve a significantly lower curtailment. To conclude, I hope you'll agree that electromobility will be intrinsically coupled with the power system, at least once we start getting a high enough penetration rate, and that the EVs can be used to provide energy storage and demand response. Again, assuming that we have some control over their charging. The charging station operations are influencing both the electromobility side and the power system side, which gives us an interesting way to control both or either of these systems. Here are some directions for future work that we're pursuing, and with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and please don't hesitate to reach out with any questions that you might have.